Om Shri Sai Ram, offering myself at the divine lotus feet of my most beloved Bhagavan, Sai Ram, and warm greetings from Sri Satya Sai Institute of Higher Learning, Department of Languages and Literature, English. We shall begin today's session with a short prayer. Om. Om. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kuru Me Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada. Om Sai Ishwaraya Vitmahe Satyadevaya Dhimahi Tanna Sarvaः Prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Sai Ram and good morning to all. Today we gathered here to witness the Day 2 proceedings of our flagship event, Lit Treat Edition 4, International Seminar on Earthy Echoes in English Literature. Yesterday, Day 1 of the event, saw eminent speakers speaking to us and having a very interactive session. Today, we have two other eminent scholars joining us to address the gathering on site and online. So, we shall begin the day's proceedings. I request Ms. Sai Archana Murthy, Faculty of Department of Languages and Literature, English, to introduce the first speaker for the day. Sai Ram.
Om Shri Sai Ram. I offer my humble pranams at Bhagwan's lotus feet. This morning, it is my honor to introduce the first speaker of the day, Professor Pramod K. Nayar. Professor Nayar is a professor at the University of Hyderabad since 2001. Since September 2022, he has been the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, a Fellow at the Royal Historical Society, and a Fellow of the English Association. As part of his remarkable academic journey, he was a Charles Wallace India Trust British Council Fellow at the University of Kent, UK in 2001, and a Fulbright Fellow at Cornell University 2004-05. The prolific Professor Nayar's writings have appeared in the form of academic monographs, popular history writing, academic book reviews, essays in scholarly journals, and over 300 essays and journalistic pieces in newspapers and periodicals in India. His academic interests and specializations include colonial writings on India, travel writing, post-humanism, and cultural studies. Significantly, he has published on extreme cultures and subjects like the Bhopal tragedy. In recent years, he has focused on human rights, vulnerability, and precarious lives with a series of books and essays on the theme Bhopal's Ecological Gothic 2017 and Eco-Precarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture 2019. To mention two notable achievements among many, in 2018, Professor Nayar received the Visitors Award for Best Research in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences from the President of India. And in 2020, a study conducted by the Center of Publications Ethics, Pune, showed that Professor Nayar was the second most published researcher in arts and humanities in India and South Asia, and seventh in South and Southeast Asia in terms of work indexed in the Web of Science. Sir, your illustrious work and your research with societal and academic impact is an inspiration to several students and researchers. We at Sri Satya Sai Institute of Higher Learning thank you for accepting our invitation and joining us in the flagship event of the Department of English, the Lit Treat Edition 4. Now, over to you, sir. Professor Pramod K. Nayar.
Thank you. Thank you for a warm welcome and introduction. Please let me know if I'm audible and visible. Right. Good. Thank you. What I have to say concerns a specific kind of literature, a literature made necessary because of a particular set of contexts, which is no longer just climate change, but climate crisis. If you have been following newspaper reports, particularly after the IPCC reports of COP24, 23, you would have seen terrific and terrifying warnings about the rise of temperatures, the rise of sea levels, deforestation, and a whole bunch of related crises. Which means to say, climate crisis is not readable as just one element of our lives, but provokes a whole set of factors that are interrelated. This could be in the form of the death of various species, that is extinction. It could be in the form of the devastation of cities due to the rise of sea levels, and which will invariably drown out coastal cities from Madras to Californian cities. It could be in the form of severe drought or floods. What we are looking at is extreme phenomena. So it's no longer possible, I'm suggesting, to see climate change as just change. It's more like a climate crisis. And it does not require us to be environmental scientists to know that our everyday life itself has been changed. The temperatures are different now, the humidity is different, rainfall patterns are different. I know that mango trees blossom and put out their first flowers in January. Why would mango flowers blossom in January? Because the temperatures have changed. It seems to be like summer, Birds fall dead. The rivers run dry. Not at summertime, but in January. So what we are looking at is a very serious set of elements coming together. Not very pleasant, not very safe. So when I am saying reading environment, writing disaster, I identified three forms through which this crisis can be communicated. First, the apocalyptic. Second, the social realist. Third, the elegiac. So the apocalyptic, the social realist, and the elegiac are three ways of talking about climate crisis, and it's, like I said, attendant anxieties and dangers. This would be the cultural challenge of climate change. How to produce, how to write in a language which will help people understand not only the science of climate change, but also accept it. So what would be the best way of telling people that, we have a crisis? You could frighten them to death with it. That would be the apocalyptic. You could provide enormous amounts of detail. That would be the social realist. Or you could be mournful and whining like students when they are given assignments. Oh my God, one more. So you can have multiple modes of talking about climate crisis. And it has never been very clear which one has to be the most common. Hollywood solves the problem. Hollywood solves most problems of opting for the apocalyptic. You look at the spate of films, 2012, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Day After Tomorrow, they're all apocalyptic. Usually the Americans save the day, but in many cases the Americans also die, which is good for everyone except for the Americans. And in most cases, as we know, technology is used as a response. Governments have to come together, put together a measure of solidarity to talk about and solve things, right? But in many cases, there are no real answers. You can, of course, migrate to Mars now that they have discovered how to get to Mars. But the point is it really a solution? First, it's expensive. And it takes 1.5 years to get a visa to the US. So you can imagine how many years it will take to get a visa to Mars. You'll probably grow old and die well before that. And Mars will still be there, one assumes. But the focus, as I'm trying to insist here, is that the apocalyptic mode has become the most dominant way of talking about environmental disaster, which is why when you read the environment and write disaster, the disaster has to be magnificent. Let me point you in the direction of some commonplace instances. In all these disaster texts, narratives, it won't be a localized phenomenon. One village submerged, 2 cities gone. It has to be of a global dimension, because the magnitude of the disaster has to indicate a planetary crisis, not just a local problem. So one local river flooding, as we speak, Kerala is witnessing floods again. In several parts of Kottayam district, the rivers are flooded. But you see, Kottayam being submerged is not big news. Okay, it's bad news for Kottayam people, but it doesn't become the subject of grand spectacles. So the magnitude has to be planetary. So that's one of the key features. If you look at, say, 2012 and all that, they'll show you snapshots from different parts of the world. Delhi and Munich and Rome and, of course, Manhattan and things like that, to tell us that, things are pretty bad. Not just here, but everywhere. So the apocalyptic tone adopted usually when writing disaster has to be of global magnitude. The second is, you have to have a couple of very personalized stories. It's not enough to say that 20 million people will be wiped out. 20 million is a number, it's a statistic. So you have to focus in on at least one romantic couple. There has to be a dog somewhere. A dog which is nearly killed but doesn't die. I mean, it's not appropriate to show dead animals apparently, but it's all right to show dead people. I don't know where the ethical component emerges. I'm not an ethicist, so I have no idea. But there has to be the zeroing in on one family or maybe a handful of a group of people, which is what I'm trying to get at in terms of the paradox. So you have to talk about the planetary scale of the disaster, but you can't talk about the planet unless you show one group of people. If you remember that the day after tomorrow, Jake Gyllenhaal, Dennis Quaid, there are lots of people trapped in the New York Public Library. If you remember that they use the books to keep themselves warm because they start burning the books. Because if not hell, New York has certainly frozen over. Now, yes, the planet is in crisis and it is occurring all over the world, but it is difficult for us to comprehend, as in you and me to comprehend that this is a planetary scale disaster. So what do? You do a certain kind of synecdochic version. You have the planet, then you focus in on this. This paradox of moving back and forth is central to the literature of climate disaster. Because planetary disaster is what Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject. It's too vast for us to comprehend. Cognitively speaking, if somebody were to tell you 1 trillion people, 1 trillion doesn't register in our minds. Okay, we can register a maximum number of how much Malaysia took away. But more than that, we cannot register. The Malaysia, Nirav Modi, how much they have taken away, that we can register. Beyond that is just stats for us. It doesn't register. So what is it we do? We say, oh, okay, that's a large number. What I'm pointing to is the writing of disaster demands that there has to be a very strong affective or sentimental core to the writing of planetary crisis. And you cannot, oddly enough, be sentimental about the earth, but you can be sentimental about 2 people and a dog. So that oscillation is central to how we imagine, how we write about disaster. Planetary scale, yes, and then while some statistics will scroll on your screens, right? Then you focus on one family. And it will always be the struggle of one family to escape. If you remember, I forgot the title of the tsunami film with Naomi Scott Campbell, I think. Neve Scott Campbell, I think. Which again tells us that the tsunami devastated several areas of South and Southeast Asia. But the poignancy, the sentimentality comes to us when we see the struggle of one family to survive. They're separated. parents and children are no longer together, each struggling in a different way to survive. If you recall the science fiction post-apocalyptic film I Am Legend, starring Will Smith, the protagonist, of course, dies. Will Smith dies, but there is a dog, and all of us feel, oh, there's a dog. I hope the dog doesn't die. What about Will Smith? Oh, Will Smith is dispensable. The dog shouldn't die. You know, it's important and interesting to see that we are caught between the narrative of grand magnitude and the affective component of a small family or a small group of people. And all writing of disaster moves between these two apparently conflicting or distant poles. You know, father trying to save a son, which would be the day after tomorrow. John Cusack trying to rescue his ex-wife and child in 2012. The ex is by definition an ex, and I do not know why you want to save your ex, but never mind. You know, the crisis is inevitable when there is a president, and the president and somebody else's father, somebody else's mother, etc., etc. Notice that in all these cases, you focus on the family as a basic unit. The family which has to stay together, which is disrupted in its life or everyday living. And in all cases, the emphasis is on how the family struggles to stay together. The family remains the most essential stereotype even in the middle of a planetary crisis. Now, if the Earth is one family, then why are you not worried about the rest of the family? Why are you not thinking about your distant cousin whom you have never met and you never knew of, who lives in Siberia? Because Siberia is the first to go. No, it doesn't work like that. These are the contradictions that I am pointing to, but they are central to how we imagine it. Because you see, all of our policies, particularly insurance policies, revolve around the unit of the family, isn't it? And insurance agents are very assuring people. I do not know why. They come and tell you, you know, you are very lucky. If you die, your family will get a lot of money. Can you imagine a more awkward way of selling something? And they are telling you, you should always anticipate your own horrible death so that your family will survive. And it's your duty to keep the, look, if I am gone, how does it matter how my family lives? I am anyway gone. But no, we bank upon the human insistence that the family is paramount. So even in the middle of the writing of disaster, the imagining of disaster, we cannot somehow comprehend the death of the human family, the destruction of the human race as a family. We can only think in terms of immediate families, like insurance policies, like I said. You know, I do not know how, okay, the online thing has made it easier to buy insurance policies, but if you remember, there was a time where insurance people would come and tell you, you know, your family will be very rich as soon as you die. And you begin to wonder, should I slaughter this fellow for trying to sell me insurance in this fashion, or should I buy the rhetoric? Because it's not very reassuring to be told, you know, this is how it will be, and that your family will only benefit after you die. So the one way to ensure that your family is safe for you to kill yourself. It's like that meme doing the round since last week. Somebody goes and asks somebody else, would you like to make the world a better place? Yes, I'm thinking of killing myself. Yes, that's exactly what we had in mind. As soon as you kill yourself, the world will be a better place. Insurance is a bit like that. But the point I'm trying to make, despite the frivolous joke, is that the expansive notion doesn't occur to us very easily, very quickly. The third thing I want to talk about here is there is considerable interest in the science of climate change, but we don't quite understand the science of climate change. Critics have always objected to the fact that people like you and me, you sitting there in that hall and me here, we don't really come to grips with the science of climate change. and yet we imagine climate change. This is the tension between the science and the literature of climate change, within which the question of disaster actually occurs, where the scientists will tell us 1.5 degrees centigrade rise in temperature will produce the following consequences. These many species will die, this will happen, and all sorts of things they will tell you. But note the fact that much of that disaster is imagined even within science. Because the science tells us that if the temperature goes up by 1.5, the following will happen. The temperature has not gone up. The conditional if is important. You people teach English communication skills, right? And you know the use of conditionals. So if this happens, the following will happen. But you see, it didn't happen. It has not happened yet. So science is also extrapolating a given set of data to say 5 years later, 15 years later, 55 years later. I was struck by people telling us that, one day the sun will become a super red giant. And once that happens, the first 5 planets will be burnt up. So that's a very unpleasant prospect, being burnt up and all that. Nobody wants to be in that situation. Then the scientists will tell you it will happen roughly 150,000 years from now. And my question then would be, 150,000 years. All right. I am currently worried about petrol prices in the next 1 month. I'm not really thinking about what 150,000 years later things will be like. Frankly, as the famous line goes in Gone with the Wind, I don't give a damn. That's where the rhetoric and the literature comes into play. The literature of climate crisis tells us that we should think about future generations, the future of the planet, even if we are not there. Admittedly, this is a little difficult. Remember my point about the insurance salesman trying to tell you that your family will be very prosperous the minute you die. Within 1 week of your dying, will release a lot of money. Money which you never earned in your lifetime. Fair enough. Because you didn't make so much money because you are putting money away in insurance policies. That's the reason. But the scientists will tell you 150,000 years, the sun will become a super giant. Okay, and is that something I should worry about since I'm highly unlikely to be here 150,000 years from now? Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 2 is all climate disaster literature forces us to imagine many later generations of human life. Many later generations of human life. So this is extrapolation again. How do we know that 150,000 years humans will look like us? Already the next generation is unrecognizable. Have you looked at teenagers, your own and others? You can't see their face for the hair, long beards, long hair. And you ask, who's this? I am your son. Oh, really? I wouldn't have known. They're already practically halfway to something else. Then there are people who do body modifications, wear all sorts of things. And now the recent trend is you say that you identify yourself as somebody else. I identify myself as a female today. Last week in Berlin, there was a gathering of people who identified themselves as animals. In science, it's called therianthropy, because you think you are an animal inside. You remember, it's the stuff of all fables, shape-changing, creatures becoming humans, human becoming creatures, some becoming beautiful women, some becoming ugly women. It's a part of our fabular culture anyway. Now, in this case, you are told, imagine 150,000 years later. The crux of the problem is, how can you even imagine what 150,000 years later Earth will be like? It's not within our abilities to imagine. But, and this is the crucial part, the literature directed at future disaster speaks about the ethical imagining of the future. The ethical imagining of the future. In this case, it is not a response to the crisis of climate change today, but it's a responsibility towards the future generations. I'm marking a shift here. I and my generation is not being called upon to respond to today's crisis, but the imminent crisis of some centuries, some generations later. At this point, unless the organizers are regretting calling me for the kinds of jokes I make, I have one more. If Vijay Lakshmi is in the audience, she will say her head is going to call her and ask her, is this the kind of person you recommend? I understand, my colleagues have the same feeling. But let's ask this question. We are being told to be responsible to the future generations. What about our forefathers? They didn't have that responsibility, or what? They did whatever they could, and now they left the dirty job to us. They didn't care that they were polluting the earth, killing the animals, violating the plants, and doing all sorts of things, which we now recognize as significantly anti-earth. And now they are telling us, you have to be very responsible, Your future grandchildren will not be able to breathe the same air. The ethical dimension is always rather difficult. As I remind my colleagues in philosophy department, those of who will talk to me, that is, I pose these kinds of questions, and eventually the conversation breaks and I say, they'll just say, Pramod, just have your tea and go now. What is all this? But I ask them, how come our grandfathers didn't think about what they were doing into the earth? And now we are supposed to think about our grandchildren? I am not going to be around. How is it my problem? Look, 300 years ago, when steam was invented and global temperatures started rising with new forms of agriculture and industrialization, people said cities were getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Nobody thought about stopping industrialization. Do you know what they did? A man called John Carrier came along and invented the air conditioner. It is safe to assume that 3 generations from now, they will invent something that will help them solve the problems of weather and climate. Why not? If you can imagine disaster, you can find solutions to the disaster as well. What stops us? After all, we are imagining. But, and this is the key part, literature tells us that we cannot afford to be not ethical. Excuse me. That the imagining of any kind of disaster must be connected to the ethical imagination of a future generation, which includes disappearing people, disappearing species of plants and animals, disappearing languages, and so on and so forth. Does anybody here remember the first picture of the entire Earth shot from space? 1972, the blue marble picture as it is called. It was taken from outside, from a spacecraft, and it was the first picture of the entire Earth. And it shows the Earth hanging in the inky blackness of space. And for the first time, people recognized how fragile the planet is. Here is a ball hanging in space with nothing tethering it, nothing holding it down. And you think, my God, all around is this blackness, and there is this one thing, just that little speck. It's the only place we, as of now, know as home. It was brought home to people that we live on a planet whose existence is not guaranteed. That picture triggered a whole bunch of not only nostalgic but other forms of imagining our world. Because you see, in order to think of our world, you need to imagine something about it. And this image triggered that imagination. It said, oh, look at what it is like. My fourth example about the imagining of disaster, when we are writing about it, is the IUCN's Red List. I don't know whether you know of something called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is IUCN. It updates something called a Red List. The Red List is a list of species likely to disappear. It's the endangered animals list. And it's a very, very important list for conservationists, philosophers, and literary scholars like you and me. And it's a scale. So the most endangered at one end and the least endangered at the other. Do you know which one is the least endangered species? Humanity. As per the IUCN scale, the species with the least chances of disappearing is humanity. Now my question to you then is, how do we visualize the end of the earth or the end of the planet if humanity is the least endangered? You see the paradox, I hope, that if humanity is the least endangered, we can do other things, talk about other creatures. But no, disaster films will not speak about the eventual disappearance of the earthworm. You can't have a film with a title like Earthworm, an Endangered Species. Nobody will go and watch it. It's not exactly Jawan. No? What do? The conservation literature and the conservation science also has a certain aesthetic component to it. Let's put it very bluntly. We will be in favor of protecting animals who are nice and warm and cuddly. Have you seen campaigns to save the vulture, the earthworm, or the yellow-horned frog? Suppose I were to tell you that the yellow-horned frog is in danger of disappearance and I'm collecting money to save it, you will tell me several rude things and tell me to go away. But if I tell you the koala bear, the panda is in danger, you'll get more money, you'll get more interest. More people will be enthusiastic. So there's a certain aesthetic appeal to the bear, to the koala, to the panda. But the earthworm, the frog, oh, for God's sake, the vulture, my goodness. Although last month there was a report that the vulture population in India is going down. And the vulture population going down is a matter of considerable danger because it means that there are rotting carcasses of animals and creatures left just like that. These are carrion eaters. They therefore play a very important role in the life cycle of the earth. But you see, the vulture is not a very attractive bird, isn't it? If you say peacock, not just because of the Prime Minister, but everybody will say, oh, peacock we must save. Peacock, yeah. So the koala bear, very cute little, nice little thingy. But the other problem is also, suppose I were to tell you that the great white shark is endangered. You'll say, oh, really? The great white shark, I see. Okay. Or the grizzly bear. And we tell you, we must do something to save the grizzly bear. And then you look at the grizzly bear, preferably with a lot of solid iron bars between you and the grizzly bear. And the grizzly bear is 400 pounds in weight and roughly the size of a house. And then you say, this one needs saving. With one swipe, it will decimate 3 of us. It needs saving, is it? Or like the great white shark, needs saving. I'll tell you, no, but you see, in the food chain, these are mega predators. They are very essential. You say, yes, but how do I save the grizzly bear? So I start looking at the grizzly bear from its toes and go right all the way. I can't even see its head. And I said, I am very insignificant compared to this tall building of a bear. Again, our aesthetic component. All conservation campaigns have this particular problem. There has to be a certain emotional and aesthetic component to the writing of disaster. To put it in very crude terms, ugly people don't get saved when the world ends. You have to be good looking, have a certain appeal. You should be cute if you are an animal to be saved. Which is why Hollywood films will start fairly decent looking people who are in the middle of a crisis. You won't find ugly people there. to open to. If they're ugly people, they deserve to die. Sounds terrible to say that, but that's the politics of filmmaking, and that's the politics of conservation as well. So, two parts to what I just said. The affective and the aesthetic is central to the imagining of disaster. Like I said, the earthworm, mind you, the earthworm is called the farmer's friend. The earthworm is absolutely central to the fertility of the soil. Have you ever seen a campaign to save the earthworm? We don't like the wrigglies, no? We don't like the creepy crawlies. There is no campaign to save the cockroach because the cockroach will survive everything. We are told it's the hardiest creature of all species. Cockroaches have always been there, they'll always be there. Do you know when they set up the permanent station at Antarctica, they found cockroaches there too? And you think you have problems in your house? They went all the way to Antarctica and discovered cockroaches even there. And they begin to think, what is this? But the cockroach will survive. It's supposed to be, science tells us, the hardiest of creatures. But you can't therefore think in terms of saving the cockroach. Now, the larger point I want to make is, if you think in terms of the food chain, all of these are important. I want to shift to another kind of example to emphasize this question of the affective and the aesthetic. You have heard of the woolly mammoth. Thanks to Ice Age and continental drift and animated films. But the woolly mammoth has been extinct for quite some time. Humanity did play a role. In that as well. But there is an effort to bring back the woolly mammoth at a park in Siberia called Pleistocene Park. It is where a scientific experiment called rewilding or de-extinction is going on. The revival of dead species. The woolly mammoth is one of them. The ibex, the European ibex, is a second one. It's a technology of cloning and genetic engineering that is underway. You can look it up. Pleistocene Park and rewilding. The Global Rewilding Conference was held a year and a half ago at Jaipur in India, and there's a document published on that subject. Rewilding, the bringing back of the wild. So why the woolly mammoth? The woolly mammoth, like the grizzly bear, was the largest land mammal of its time. And you don't want to encounter a woolly mammoth, especially one who has not had food, though it was a vegetarian. Now, what is the purpose of the woolly mammoths? What is the function? When they are called megafauna, very large animals. When they walk, they stirred up the soil. Okay, they disturbed the soil, which was essential for little bits of carbon monoxide to escape. Now, since the megafauna are dead, the permafrost covers the entire north section of the earth. It's frozen, but the gases inside are building up. One day they'll emerge and the entire planet will become a greenhouse. Because the permafrost is not being disturbed. The permafrost can only be disturbed by very large creatures, which would be the woolly mammoth. So they have a particular function. In other words, what I'm trying to emphasize is, for conservation biologists and conservation literature, it's important to imagine disaster affectively and aesthetically, but it also requires some understanding of the process in the food chain. What is the role? Which is why my example of the earthworm and the vulture. There are very specific roles in the food chain. What do they do? You know that when certain kinds of plants have to pollinate, coconut trees for example, it requires the cooperation of water and wind and birds. Right? It's a combination of several of these. Suppose the birds die. How does pollination happen? As the poet Mahmud Darwish would ask, where would the birds fly after the last sky? Where would they fly after the last sky? But the question is not about where the birds would fly. The question is, what else will be unable to fly? Because in the imagining of disaster, it is not ever the extinction of one species alone. It will be the co-extinction of several others as well. No species dies alone. When one species dies, those depending upon it will also die. When one species dies, those whom it used to destroy will flourish. Which leads me to my next point. In the imagining of disaster, we have to see all lives as entangled. Just when you think you are having a particularly intimate moment, you should consider the fact that there are at least 1 million bacteria on your lips and in your armpits. Which means to say basically you are never alone. There are 10 raised to power 14 bacteria in your stomach which help you digest your food. Which is why people who have stomach ailments are often told to take probiotics to enable the growth of bacteria. You are alive because there is bacteria in your stomach. Think of what I am referring to here. This is mutual dependency, or what after Stacy, Alaimo and others we call entangled lives. When one species population's demographic changes, it affects other species as well. Some of you may remember during the lockdown there were pictures of wild animals out on the streets. I don't know whether you saw, there was a South African penguin wandering around in the streets of Pretoria, I think. And there were coyotes in the streets. All sorts of creatures came out because there was no humanity on the streets, because everybody was under lockdown. Newspapers carried several reports on this. See, when we say entangled lives, we are not speaking only of mutual dependency, but also of mutual animosity, predators versus prey. Suppose the predator species dies, the other will flourish. What was traditionally its prey would flourish, which means there's a certain amount of imbalance that enters the system. You know, that the biome, as it is called, where everything is particularly slotted with a specific function, with a specific role. One species goes down, the other will rise. So the disappearance of the vulture will produce more rotting carcasses, which will stimulate the growth of certain kind of harmful bacteria, which will spread infections. It's a great chain of being. So the crucial part here is to understand that we cannot think of imagining planetary disaster in terms of either this or that species. Species disappearance is always co-extinction. My third related point, or fourth, fifth, I've forgotten the number of points, so if you are writing it down, please write it down in a particular sequence, okay? The next point I want to make is, when a species disappears, it's not the last animal dying, but an entire culture of life disappearing. Periodically, you will see reports of the last few speakers of a language. You know, and when that person dies, that language will die. You will see reports about endangered languages. Some places have departments and centers for endangered languages. You know, I'm never very sure in which language the people there speak, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, if it's a center for endangered languages and 3 people are hired as faculty and 3 of them speak 3 endangered languages, then what is the common language between them? Naturally, they'll all come to English at some point. Though in many of our departments, given the way they speak, English is an endangered language. I mean, if you look at your student assignments, you will know. The prepositions are wrong, the verbs are all wrong, the tenses are wrong. English is certainly an endangered language, but we cannot say that in public or we'll lose our jobs. But when you think in terms of endangered species, suppose, for example, the 2 of the oldest animals were to disappear, the horse and the dog. 2 of the oldest domesticated creatures by humanity are dogs and horses. Dogs, no, we can't ask the dogs why you are domesticated. Dog psychology is not something we understand. which is perhaps all to the better. My colleague and I take care of 13 dogs at the Humanities building in the University of Hyderabad. Our strays, a large group of dogs. Some of you might know, one comes to our classes and meetings. He's called Ramesh. And there are several dogs we take care of. And several of our colleagues, our authorities are unhappy that there are so many of these dogs all the time and that we are feeding them. So we feed them in the morning, the students feed them in the evening. So I said, look, some of these are more loyal than my colleagues to the department. They come to class every day. Ramesh comes to every class, every single meeting, every single department event. If you look up our events, the ones that my colleague Anna Kurian and I organize, if you look at the pictures, there will be Ramesh near the speaker's foot. There will be at least one picture with Ramesh there. So I said, let's rename the School of Humanities as the School of Human Abilities. Human and animal, so the human. My dean didn't take very kindly to the suggestion, because that was the day that he called a meeting of heads and our dog walked into the heads meeting. So somebody said, who is he? I said, it is waiting for an order to be appointed head of some department or the other. Anyway, he is more loyal, attends every class, full class, not like students who walk out halfway through. I don't think it happens at Satyasai, but it happens in our place. So given its loyalty, it should be given something, a faculty position. And has attended enough literature classes to be able to recite tradition and the individual talent. But the larger point is something else. We have grown to depend on our animals. Our animals depend on us. There is a chain, right? When one species disappears, a cultural history also disappears. And that cultural history involves us. For example, think of domesticated or agricultural animals like the oxen to plough the fields, like goats, milch cattle, and now of course the guide dogs that we have, animals for entertainment purposes as well. Though one suspects that the animals are more entertained by the stupidity of the humans than we are by their quaint, cute antics. I don't know whether you have seen this lovely meme. This is a chimpanzee in a cage, and he has just grabbed Charles Darwin by the collar, and there are several other humans standing around, and the chimpanzee tells Darwin, I don't care what you think, I am in no way related to these people. The chimpanzee is offended that the chimpanzee's cousins are humans. I can understand the chimpanzee's sentiment. But the larger point I want to make is, in the imagining of disaster, we are not looking at species loss. We are looking at the loss of a way of life. Agricultural habits, for example, and agricultural practices, which are driven by this human-animal combination. Right? And increasingly, you know that several humans are able to live because of transplantation from animals. It's called xenotransplantation. This might sound offensive to some people, but I can't avoid doing that. A lot of organ transplant comes from pigs. Pig species, as a species, offers more solutions to damaged internal organs of the humans. Remember my example of 10 to the power 14 bacteria in our stomachs. And you have to ask yourself, how autonomous, self-contained is any species? The answer is, there is no species which is completely autonomous. None. You've seen buffaloes with a little white bird, the egret on top. It's a symbiotic relationship, right? All life is symbiotic. The bacteria keep you alive. The plants produce the oxygen which you breathe. Everything we are, everything we do, depends on our cohabitation with another life form, at least one other life form. Which means to say that the destruction of one species will automatically impact adversely several other species, including humans. At that time, I'm sure Bill Gates will come up with a solution if all dogs or cats disappear. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact that there are things called robo-animals now. They have therapeutic uses. They are, if you look at a journal called the Journal of Nursing, there's a whole lot of material being published on how autistic children and others are served better by robo-animals. Because a robo-animal never tires. It's always systematic, unlike parents who sometimes can forget, or nurses who can be careless, and they respond better. There are studies which do that. So you see, what we are looking at is, in the imagining of disaster, a certain interconnectedness within the planet. That no amount of segregation, theoretical or practical, political or cultural, can survive a disaster. It's not possible. So you might feel passionate about this or anything else, but there will always be a certain amount of mutual dependency. Okay. My next example in the imagining of disaster is the accumulation of something we call waste. In 1993, A.R. Emmons published a poem called Garbage. And he said, garbage is the poem of our times. You know that Elie Wiesel said every age produces a genre for its purposes. The Greeks had the tragedy. Ours is the testimony, he said. The testimony after the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel was an Auschwitz survivor. Waste will be the theme song for our next generation because it is the single largest problem we face now, waste disposal. And all imagining of disaster, if you look at Cormac McCarthy, The Road, either the book or the film, you look at the book of Eli, you look at I Am Legend, there will be pictures of abandoned vehicles, empty stores, long avenues where vehicles are on either side, there are no people, waste. And waste is being read here in two ways, in two forms. One is the accumulation of redundant material, and the other is the wasting away of material. As in, I don't know whether you have met the phrase wasting away. It was used in the 19th century to describe people who die of tuberculosis. They wasted away, they would say. No? Waste is the poem of our time. Garbage is the poem of our time because there are people who waste away, wasted people, and there is an incredible accumulation of waste or garbage. So much so, I'm sure you are aware of the fact that we now have a waste recycling industry. It has become a specialization, like linguistics or something. What do you specialize in? Waste. All right. I don't know whether that is a descriptor of what kind of person you are or that is a discipline. You cannot actually go around and say, I am a waste person. Though technically it might be correct because you are specializing in waste. And as a result, now you have things called discard studies. And discard in this case is not a verb. It's not an injunction by the teacher saying discard studies. It means the study of discard. And it has an equivalent called trash aesthetics. And periodically you will see people who are talking about and depicting materials from waste put together as art form. It describes much of modern art also, but let's not go there. You don't know what they are doing, right? I mean, if you look at modern art, there was this cute little cartoon about two children who are looking at a contemporary modernist painting in the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and they look at that bizarre thing there, highly valued, and one kid tells the other, let's go away before mother says you did it. Which is a very accurate description of what modern art looks like. Nobody can make sense of it. Everybody praises it. But waste, and it has two effects that I would like to point to. One is waste also, like extinct species, represents the end of a line. It begins as a product for something and it ends with redundancy. So waste is actually, in one sense, a history. It's a teleological process. So waste has a history. Waste is history. What you discard is your personal history. What you consign as trash. Remember, in detective films, they're always looking through somebody's garbage bins. And you feel a little sorry for detectives. You think you are a glamorous profession, and what you're doing is actually you're rooting through garbage bins. Not very glamorous, isn't it? A bit like reading assignments. In both cases, you're looking through a lot of garbage. Or PhD theses, for that matter. I don't see much difference these days. But this is clearly not adding to my popularity in Satya Sai, I understand. But then winning popularity contest is Shah Rukh Khan's problem, not mine. So you can actually think in terms of waste as producing or as the product of a teleology. And what we now see as contemporary waste is actually a history of humanity itself. So there's a long line where, for example, buildings fall into ruin, trash accumulates, and this is the point I want to conclude with in this case of my theme of waste. There will always be wasted lives. Wasted lives is a shorthand term for people who are made redundant. I'm sorry, did something happen? I heard somebody flitted across my screen. It's a bit like those ghost films, where you look in one.
We just turned on our audio so that you can hear our laughter.
Oh, that's really not necessary. But to get back to the point, when Zygmunt Bauman wrote a book called Wasted Lives, what he was talking about was, we live in an era where several people are rendered waste or excess. Now, waste can be of two kinds. You're excess or surplus, or you're redundant, as in you are no longer of productive or functional use. Think of a period such as ours in the neoliberal era, where most people work on contractual basis in what is called by economists the gig economy. The gig economy. Flexible jobs, contractual jobs, but they are also disposable people. There's another kind of disposable people. People who can be sacrificed for larger purposes. And I want to give you a couple of specific examples. 1945 to 1954. The period of the largest number of nuclear testing conducted by the United States in the Pacific Islands, which includes the Bikini Atoll. Okay? The islands were not uninhabited. There were people there. The consequences of the nuclear tests included radiation poisoning among the native people of the Pacific Islands. First example. My second example comes from within the United States itself. Remember, the United States is a democracy. It distributes misery everywhere, uniformly. When they were trying to find an appropriate testing place for their nuclear bombs, they decided that Utah was the appropriate place. Then somebody pointed out that 150 miles in one direction of the test site, there were small towns. But the government decided that they are downwinders. It doesn't matter. 50 years later, the incidence of cancer in that particular region is 4 times the national average in the United States. Now they have been writing and documenting it, and their memoirs are available on the Atomic Energy Commission's websites. The people have discovered that they were 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. They were fetuses at the time of the nuclear testing, and now they have cancer. Everybody in that area has cancer. My two examples are examples of people who will waste away. Disposable people. Lives, as Judith Butler would say, which are not grievable. It doesn't matter whether they live or die. This is a component and a constituent of climate crisis discourse and literature, because it moves away from talking about other species to looking at how some species are rendered vulnerable, are placed in this category called disposable people. What does it actually mean? What does it mean to say that some lives are disposable? It means very simply, somebody has placed a lower value on certain classes of people. Some of you know Bhopal tragedy, right? The slums around the Union Carbide plant were the first victims. They couldn't run anywhere. That was their home. There are pictures and videos of the children's children of that time still playing in the polluted soil and water of the Union Carbide plant, which is now defunct. The material is still in the soil. In the case of Pacific Islands, Marshall Islands and others, the soil, like in the case of Chernobyl, will contain cesium-137 isotope radioactive. It will remain contaminated with radiation for the next 154,000 years, which is the half-life of cesium. People still live there. They are disposable people. And if you recall what I said about what will happen to the sun 150,000 years later, think about this. It is no longer possible, despite Pramod Nayar's jokes about it, to think in terms of the end of a disaster period. Most of our disasters, including pollution, will outlast all of us, because the degree, the intensity of contamination will be not measurable in human life terms. The materials embedded, the toxins contaminating our soil, our water, our air, will remain there for the next 150,000 years. My second point is, there is no such thing as a local disaster. Remember, I began with this argument. Let me give you one more example from Chernobyl. After the Chernobyl accident, they declared a 30-mile exclusion zone around Chernobyl. They declared it an exclusion zone. Several scientists said that is one of the most stupid ideas I've ever made, simply because the air doesn't stop at the exclusion zone boundary, does it? The consequences are interesting. Butterflies appearing in Sweden, thousands of miles away, were born mutated. And there are pictures of this by Cornelia, I forget her last name. She's a Smithsonian artist who compiled images of Lepidoptera species in Sweden and Switzerland. Black rain fell in England after Chernobyl, which means to say that none of these massive disasters are actually local. It's planetary. So when we say, let us imagine disaster when we are talking about the environment, we can't say that this river is polluted or that soil is polluted because of two things. This contamination, this toxicity is not limited in space or in time. They will outlast us by several centuries because their half-lives are very, very long. It is what historians call deep time. It's deep time. And it is beyond geocultural, geopolitical boundaries. So the only way we can think of imagining disaster, writing disaster, is to expand the local into a much larger spatial and temporal frame. It is beyond our space, our immediate spatiality. It is beyond our immediate time frame. Which is the reason why climatologists tell us, think of 3 generations from now. So like I said, despite my jokes about it, there is no other way to imagine it. If there is soil, air toxins such as the nuclear, the poison from that radiation remains for 150, 160, 170,000 years. So Chernobyl was not a local accident, as the Soviets tried to tell us. A nuclear bomb is not so limited. When people say a limited war, or when we say we can bomb a city in Pakistan, the city in Pakistan is separated 100 miles from Amritsar actually. If you bomb their city, our city will go too. That is why the scientists come up with the argument of mutually assured destruction, acronym MAD. Mutually assured. You cannot destroy one city without destroying several others. Remember what I said, one species dying means other species will die. You cannot speak of the extinction of only one precisely because it will impact adversely several others about which we don't even know. We don't even know. So in the case of nuclear disasters, this is the effect you will see. I will give you a concrete example from a study which appeared 3-4 years ago. It's called Silent Arctic, in reference to Silent Springs, Rachel Carson's pioneering environmental text. Marla Coles, who is the author of this book, did some research and found something very peculiar. The Inuit tribes of the Greenland belt and in Siberia had very high degree of pesticide in their blood and other kinds of chemical toxins. Very high. And she was puzzled because the Inuits are not in the area of any industry. There. So she was wondering where they got this pesticide into the system. She researched considerably and she discovered something fascinating and frightening. And that is, they ate the meat of beluga whales and seals because they need that kind of meat to stay alive in their Arctic winter. The whales and seals consumed the water and plankton from the northern Atlantic. Okay. Third, the Atlantic in the north had received pesticides from industries in Pittsburgh because you see, water flows. It carries toxins and contaminants. It flowed all the way from the United States up to the Greenland belt. This is what she calls the Arctic paradox. The Arctic paradox also illustrates the connected nature of planetary crisis. That you may not live in the immediate vicinity of a toxic and toxin manufacturing industry, but you'll still get it from somewhere else. Which means to say that all parts of the world are interconnected. Even the interior Amazon tribes have received pollution. Because you see, water and ocean currents are moving all over the world. You can't stop them. I mean, so far we are not for a technology to do that. So the theme of my talk has, as you can imagine here, and as you might have noted here, is entangled lives. So the industry is in Pittsburgh, United States. The pollution happens in Greenland, thousands and thousands of miles away, and it's unbelievable how they get it. The pollution goes from industries in the Pittsburgh area into the Atlantic. It flows upwards. The beluga whales and the seals consume it. The Inuits consume the meat from those creatures and they get the pesticides. So you see, without their knowledge, without participating in it, they are still part of what I elsewhere call planetary precarity. Everybody is at risk. To greater, I mean, it's not the same kind of risk, I accept that, but they're still at risk. Which means to say that you cannot imagine planetary disaster except as a series of interconnected problems, a series of interconnected disasters. I'm going to stop here so we have some time for discussion. The discussion, I hope, will not entail why I make certain kinds of jokes. Thank you.
To ask now.
Thank you, sir. I'm Dr. Rani here.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear you or understand what you're saying.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is Dr. Rani from this end. So thank you for that brilliant talk. You said not to talk about the jokes, but I must say, this Oxford Handbook of Eco-Criticism, and I made a reference to this in my talk yesterday. Michael Branch has this interesting essay on Are You Serious? And a modest proposal for environmental humor. And I just think all talks and writings on environment and the disaster are kind of dreary and bleak and dystopian. It is quite necessary, I would think, to have the jokes. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. You should perhaps introduce Rohan Chakravarti's cartoons, environmental cartoons in class.
Okay.
He's one of India's most brilliant conservationist humorists and draws some amazing cartoons.
Okay.
It's great fun. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, madam, for that.
It also leads me to the other essay that he refers to there, I'm sure. I think it is Gressner's, where he says, sick of nature. And he says, reading something on nature writing is like going to Sunday school because it's so humorless. So
I agree with that. But the problem is also what I pointed to. Would we take it seriously if we are not frightened to death about it? So the problem has been, as you rightly pointed out from that it sometimes becomes extremely difficult to get through some of these texts. They are dreary. It's like reading Russian novels, where every second page somebody comes and says, grandpa has hanged himself in the barn, or the horse has fallen into the pond or something like that. And then everybody sits around looking gloomy. And when you open your salad bowl, there's a caterpillar in it. It's consistently. But the problem that I discovered is that suppose I make a joke about polar bears, then people are offended because everybody is woke and politically correct now. You don't make that kind of joke. So people will say, you think it's laughing matter? Huh? How can you joke about it? Huh? How can you be so insensitive? Huh? At which point some kind of homicide will take place and the story ends. So apparently the only way of communicating the urgency of disaster is to speak like a Dostoevsky mixed with Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens, as we know, was a serial killer. He published in serial form. And the only way you can read Charles Dickens is by skipping alternate pages. I don't think it's possible to read Bleak House page by page, para by para. I mean, can you imagine anybody titling a novel Bleak House and expecting that people will pick it up and read it? Oh, this is fun. It's called Bleak House. So there is somebody, I think, I forget the first name, my last name is McFarland, has noted the fact that the apocalyptic is the most dominant tone in environmental writing. Because everybody has to be scared witless about it. And people will have nightmares that tomorrow morning there will be an asteroid coming through the roof, Martians will kidnap me, etc., etc. Though the Martian is possibly kidnapping you because a child needs a human specimen for homework next morning, you know. And that is why I find Rohan Chakravarti madam, as you pointed out, very refreshing, you know, that you can deliver the same message by talking about the disappearance of, say, animal species or the ruining of habitats. And I think it's quite powerful. It's quite powerful. But apparently, you're not supposed to laugh about serious subjects. Although, if you look at the Oxford Book of Death, some of the best things on death are jokes.
No, sir, that's why he also says we have to laugh with and not laugh at.
Yes, love
Yeah,
it.
and
love
I would
it.
think the 4, 5, or 6 talks that we are having across this seminar across 2 days, I would think our students will vouch for it, that they're going to remember the messages that came across through your jokes much more, at least much longer than they would the other very serious and theoretized talks. So that's
Yes,
yeah.
but I think you put your finger on it. Yes, people will not remember long passages of very dreary type, talking about the end of the woolly mammoth and how this happened and that destruction happened, as much as 2 lines of or a meme about it. Quite right, quite right.
Saram sir, my name is Sai Harshita, research scholar of the department. Am I audible, sir?
I think you have to do something about where you are holding the mic.
Saram sir, now?
Now it's better. Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. My question is, while we're talking about coexistence and co-extinction, and in the jargon of conservation and all, we say save the panda, save the koala bear. Let's all get together and save. I have an issue with the word save, because we are also probably somewhere in the future need to be saved. Are we in the position to save when we are also in need to be saved? Yes, sir.
Need to be said. Well, it's very interesting you ask that question, because I would direct you to a novel by Charlotte McConaghy. It's called Migrations. It's a novel that I think you could introduce into your syllabus at some point as contemporary fiction, but also as part of environmental studies. I'm sorry, I don't know whether you have an environmental studies or environmental literature component, but it's possible to have an elective, something like that. She makes a very interesting point. She says, once the birds go, we will be left all alone. It's on the opening page of a novel. Once the animals all die, we will be left alone. And then the point the novel makes is, we will mourn the passing of these animals, but who will be there to mourn us? And what you see in many of these extinction discourses is the possibility that humanity will have to live without animal companions. So that is point number 1 as response to you. The second, the savior syndrome, which you're pointing to, is very much a human-centric syndrome. So you're spot on about it being a very, shall we say, anthropocentric ideology. It's an ideology after all, where we believe that it's our job to save. But the counter to that would be, given the fact that humanity has been responsible for a great deal of extinction and erasure of creatures, the ethicists tell us that it is now our responsibility to restore the balance, which means you are culpable and now you have to be held responsible for it. So this is, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, so my apologies for that. But despite all these, we don't have a resolution to this question. So yes, it is still anthropocentric. We believe we have the ability to save, or the right to save, or the duty to save. But there is no escaping that. But it's interesting to think, and if you are a research scholar working on it, you might want to look up the ethics of conservation. It will be useful to bring that as an angle into your study also. Thank you. Very interesting, very challenging question. Very good.
So there's another question from one of our BA students.
Saram sir, I am Sri Harshita from 3rd BA. Sir, I have a question for you that you have spoke of how every one of us are a part of food chain. If one species dies, the other will also die. So, sir, do you think that if we normally eat hens or we eat cocks, if we are killing them, if they are dying, is there verge of us also dying, of a human also dying, or getting endangered, or being extinct from this world?
I will not delve into the dilemmas of vegetarianism. It's not something I want to dabble in because it has theological and religious connotations. And as far as possible, I head in the opposite direction from religion and theology. But that's a path. Science tells us that human evolution was contingent upon animal evolution and animal consumption. So whatever the vegans might say, like I said, I'm not getting into that debate. But if certain animal species die out, there will be nutritional imbalances and there will be the necessity to find food substitutes. It will happen. So whatever the ethical dimensions or the religious dimensions of conservation and vegetarianism, there will also be a nutritive and biological dimension to it. And you cannot separate them. You cannot separate them. May I refer you, I don't get your names very clearly here, to Emilia Quinn's book, last name Quinn, Uinn. Her new book is on a history of veganism. You might want to take a look at that. Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
I am Dr. Metali, sir, here. Sir, it was not just a scholarly talk, definitely a scholarly talk, very inspiring, but I would say it was very thought-provoking. And while you kept saying, despite my jokes, I'm again coming back to that because this provocation of certain thoughts, certain ideas that you brought along with your, ideas that came through your jokes, sir. In fact, some of the points, that's what one thing that I understood is the difference between when we talk about intelligent joke and a joke, wit, humor, satire. I think, sir, that's what really caught today's talk. Specifically some examples that you talked about, extinction of some creatures like earthworm or frog, or yesterday's speaker talked about, our notion of weed.
I'm sorry?
The notion of weed, sir. W-E-E-D.
Was that Swarnalata?
Yes. And
Swarna.
yes.
Swarna goes on about it.
Yes, sir. And it was very interesting that he pointed out that we always talk about all these things with a word called unwanted. So when we say unwanted, then it's kind of a very selective, idea about conservation or preservation from our side. So thank you, sir,
to what
for
I
that.
said about things being surplus or redundant. Unwanted.
Yes, waste.
Unwanted
Yes.
is you no longer want it.
Yes.
That is one. Or the other is you have fulfilled your want and therefore it is not necessary.
Right, sir.
So
right,
it's
sir.
unwanted because it is excess or because you are done with it.
Yes, sir.
No? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
But I agree with you about the question of I don't want to step into Swarna's territory, but yes, as for the we go back a long way, so yeah. But the point is also what Madam raised at the beginning of this response session also, that lots of people are trying to figure out the right way to talk about environmental disaster. Right. So Ghosh writes The Great Derangement, classic work now, serious, analytical and all that. Then there are the jokes and the memes about it. Then there is the heavily scientific data-driven writings of the IPCC report. I read those and believe me, it's extremely difficult to get through that material, because not just of the technicalities of it, but because we don't understand the consequences that they're talking about. For example, if they tell you the breathing capacity of the lung is so many milliliters, I mean, what sense does it make to me? I have no idea what you're talking about. But they tell you that the quantum of pollution in the air what they call air quality index. Delhi is always talking about air quality index. And there the air quality index is not because of the pollution, but because of the politicians as well. But that's a different issue, you know. No, when they say you should cut down pollution, you should stop politicians from talking. It will cut down noise pollution. Why don't we think of that measure? But I don't know, and this is I think it's a very odd and awkward way of doing this. But do you inject humor into your class when speaking about environmental disaster? It's a problematic question, isn't it? The students will not take us seriously.
Right.
What do you mean you're joking about it? But you see, Ice Age and Madagascar talk a lot more about zoos and animal rights than others can.
True.
It already communicates the situation on the ground of animal transplantation and transportation, the Ice Age, for example. All of those. Now you'll say, okay, it's cartoonish, it's funny, it's odd. Fair enough, but still. Yeah. So, Dr. Mithali, please continue. You had something else to
No,
say
that's
before
what, sir. So I'm just thinking about yesterday I read this term, green humor. So I think
Yes, green
in your speech we are moving towards green satire, sir.
That's why I said, look up Rohan Chakravarti. The Hindu carries his cartoon on Sunday.
Yes.
Every Sunday.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that, sir. Yeah.
Sairam sir.
Hello.
Yes sir, Sairam sir. My name is Jagriti. My question to you is, since we were talking about personalized stories in the apocalyptic works, both in literature and in pop culture, we see in movies, especially zombie apocalypse movies, that the romanticizing of life and thus the disaster shown in the world.
Romanticizing of?
Life, the romanticizing of life. So when we show personalized stories, how far is it ethically correct to romanticize the disaster and the climate crisis? And if it is, then how does one prevent it from overpowering the ecological awareness that the work is intended to give to the audience?
Well, I have two answers to that. One is the environment has itself been constantly romanticized, whether it is Wordsworth or Thoreau. There is a very romanticized, and in ecological discourse, it's usually called Arcadian discourse, the pristine beauty of nature. You know, but think of, everybody knows Tintin Abbey, right? Yeah, we are all afflicted by that. You know, but in Tintin Abbey, when he's up on the abbey, did you note what he's looking at? He's looking at smoke coming from elsewhere. He's actually looking at civilization because the smoke comes from forest dwellers. So even when Wordsworth goes away into the ruins, he's constantly thinking of civilization. And if you pay attention to his poetry, in no case does he appreciate nature when he's in the lap of nature. He goes back home, lies on his sofa, thinks about nature and says how wonderful it was. Naturally, because when you are walking around Windermere and you are composing poetry, you might fall down and break your neck. You have to pay attention to where you are going. I have walked around Windermere, I know, it's uneven. And there are stone benches where you can sit and look like that. But if you keep looking at the rainbow, my heart leaps up when I behold the rainbow. When you do that, you get spondylitis. You're not supposed to look like that because your angle is all wrong. So there is a romanticization, and if you pay attention to Daffodils or any of the poems, at every point, the poem is about recalling nature, not being in nature. The music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. When I come back and they flash upon the inward eye, which is about reflection. It is not about being there. That is a kind of romanticization too. Let me give you another example. Henry David Thoreau, Walden. All the time running away, he says he goes away and lives in the forest. But at 4 o'clock every day, he walked to his mother's cottage outside to have tea and cake. Then he'll of course go back and say, I'm living in the jungle. How can you be living in the jungle when all the time mother is giving you tea? I mean, I understand that's what mothers do. You know, she doesn't say, go back to your hut in the jungle and live on the bark of the tree or anything. No? Mothers are mothers. No? So there is a romanticization there too. The second part of my response to you is, zombie cultural practices, zombie cultural representations are not only about the environment, they are about a certain alienatory mechanism. The zombie is a figure that comes as a critique of capitalism itself. And it emerges first in Karl Marx, actually. So much of the working class is described as zombies. They do their work unthinkingly. And the best example of that would be Charlie Chaplin in modern times. He does things like an automaton. The zombie is something like that. For those of you interested, there is a zombie manifesto. It's not a manifesto which you are supposed to read just before you become a zombie, in case you are thinking that. That's not the idea. But it's a cultural analysis of the zombie culture phenomenon itself. So I don't quite think it's a romanticization, although you could think that it's a negative romantic image. Yes. If you think of a film like World War Z, the reason why the zombie is presented in that fashion is you cannot present a solitary zombie, because zombies are like wolves, they hunt in packs. And that's a negative stereotype because you only present them as a mass. A serial killer is always solitary. No? But a zombie will not be a zombie. The zombie will come in packs, like school children. No? During the interval going to the canteen. You know? Or faculty meetings. Pretty much the same. You know? But the point is, we see the zombie as a collective threat. And that is why, so I'm not quite sure it's a romanticization. It is definitely a stereotyping. So I'll buy that. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hello. Sairam, sir. Sir, I have one question. Sir, I'm Pratiksha Pradhan, research scholar from the Department of English. Sir, I wanted to ask, like, in research, how much can we afford to be global? Sorry, local and not global.
What?
In research, how much can we afford to be local and not global?
I am the wrong person to ask that question because I do not endorse nativism. And I do not endorse looking in your own backyard. By definition, literature is what allows you to read about people who are unlike us. Whether it's working class community in Charles Dickens's London or Tudor England. If you want to only examine people and cultures of your own kind, then you don't need to read literature at all. So that's my first response. The second is, there is no 100% pure local any longer. Even when you go into the local places that you thought were isolated, you will find Pepsi there. How local is Pepsi? And in the interior villages, they'll still use Airtel connection. How is it local? So it's almost impossible now, because we live in such a hyper-connected world, to think in terms of the purely local. Let me give you one extreme example. Even if you are thinking in terms of native language literatures, suppose you are working in Kannada, Marathi or Malayalam or whatever, note the fact that you're still studying it in the English department and writing about it in the English language. Second, the one ardent desire of the native writer is to be translated into English. It could be Chandrasekhar Patil or U.R. Ananthamurthy or Girish Karnad or whoever you want to take it. That is what the Sahitya Academy does, isn't it? So when you say local traditions, all local traditions are always already infused with something larger than that. It may not be global as we understand the planetary, but it's definitely not restricted to the local. So I don't think it is possible or necessary excuse me, or even politically feasible to think purely in terms of the local. I would not endorse that. But my views on this are extremely political, so I will stop the discussion there.
The literate editions that are organized by the Department of English have given the students and the research scholars and faculty an insight into several scholarly minds. And this morning, we were indeed honored to have listened to one such luminary in the field of literature, Professor Nayar, on the topic Reading Environment, Writing Disaster, the Literature of Climate Crisis. His love for reading comics was highlighted all through the talk. And with your humorous examples, sir, and the analogies that you gave us not just the perspective to read and write on climate crisis, but also the thread of narrative that we have to maintain in discussing climate crisis. In his talk today, sir stressed the need for a sentimental and affective core regarding planetary crisis and to write crisis stories on global scales and not specific localized instances in order to bring change. Sir next spoke of the need for understanding the science of climate change and the relevance of literature in climate crisis. The ethical imagining of the future is a responsibility to the future generations. Though the IUCN updates a red list of endangered animals and several reports are generated, it is the aesthetic appeal attached to the protection of warm and cuddly animals. It is important to have an effective and aesthetic imagination in the writing of climate crisis. It also requires some understanding of the process in the food chain, like the earthworms and the vulture. It is not where will the birds fly after the last sky. Instead, it is the co-extinction of several species. All lives are entangled. When we imagine disaster in writing, we need to remember that there will always be wasted lives, though waste is history. There will be waste of excess or of redundancy. Even disasters and toxicity of the environment are planetary. All parts of the world are interconnected in receiving this toxicity. All lives are entangled. So, sir, in conclusion, as all the BA and MA students here have been enthralled by your talk, they also, I'm sure, eagerly hoping for more such talks and lectures by you. And we hope to have more such guest lectures by you at the Department of English, Sri Sathya Sai Institute of Higher Learning. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, yes, I can.
after that short break, we are back again to listen to another illuminating talk. Since yesterday, all of us have been on a literary odyssey through the realms of imagination and ecology, where literature takes on a profound role as a bridge between the human mind and the natural world. In this age of rapid environmental change, the need for stories that resonate with the heart and awaken the spirit of stewardship has never been more pressing. We just saw that in the talk given by Ms. Nivedita Subramanian yesterday, and in the talk that we just heard of Professor Nayar this morning. Eco-writing or environmental writing is a literary avenue through which writers express their profound connection with the earth and the urgent issues it faces. It's a genre that wields the power to inspire, inform, and ignite change. In our endeavor to explore the symbiotic relationship that exists between the imaginal and the ecological, in this seminar, we have with us next Dr. Shivani Sivagurunathan, who will take us along in her journey in eco-writing. Dr. Shivani has been writing and publishing fiction and poetry for over 20 years. Her first book, a collection of short stories, Wildlife on Coal Island, was published by UPM Press in 2011 and republished by HarperCollins India in the year 2012. In these stories, she created a fictional island as a means to explore the Malaysian context in ways that a non-fiction setting could not. The Indian writer Tabish Khair described the book as, I quote, R.K. Narayan's Malgudi turned into an island meets Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book in this highly readable collection of stories by a new and distinctive voice from Malaysia. I unquote. Her second book, Yalpanam, her first novel, was published by Penguin Southeast Asia in September 2021. Her short stories and poems have appeared in numerous international journals and magazines, including Agenda, Construction Literary Magazine, and many others. Her poetry collection, Being Born, and her book of fiction, What Has Happened to Harry Pillai, two novellas, came out just recently in the year 2022. She is the national coordinator for the World Poetry Movement. She currently teaches English literature and creative writing at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Dr. Shivani's stories exhibit a dynamic interplay of imagination. These stories in turn breathe life into our planet. Her short stories in Wildlife on Coal Island, which I was privileged to read, and the setting against which her first novel Yalpanam is written, both of these reflect what it means to harness the boundless powers of the human imagination to convey the beauty, fragility, and resilience of the natural world. Dr. Shivani will talk to us on the topic, The Dance of the Imaginal and the Ecological, a writer's perspective on eco-writing. Over to you, Dr. Shivani.
Thank you so much, Sridini, for that wonderfully rich introduction. And thank you for this invitation to speak today. I see everybody. Okay, hello everyone. Nice to see you. And also a special thanks to Dr. Somya for making all the arrangements, and to Sridini for reaching out and inviting me to speak today. So the title of my talk, which Sridini has already mentioned, is The Dance Between the Imaginal and the Ecological, a writer's perspective on eco-writing. And what I'll attempt to do today is unpack the ways in which the inner creative world corresponds with the outer natural environment, and the ways in which this works for a nature-oriented, place-based writer such as myself. Now, eco-oriented events, talks, and creative outputs have become extremely popular, and I think this is promising and positive, so long as impact is created and environmental consciousness grows. But my worldview has always been shaped by an ecological lens. Before I knew that was a thing, before I realized there was a field, a movement, a whole vocabulary of of concepts for ecological thinking and action. And I will unpack this foundational premise specifically in terms of how it relates to the molding of my creativity and imaginal world in the first portion of my talk. And the second portion of my talk will expand on this through how it has developed in my writing over the years and across the genres of poetry and prose. But before I get there, I'd like to go back to this idea of the dance between the imaginal and the ecological and begin by planting a crude, but I think more manageable and concrete image of a dance between inside and outside, between self and other, this and that, a dance of duality that ultimately transcends duality. And I'd state also that this dance to me is a series of moments founded on relationality. And this is what I hope to illuminate in this talk because it's also central to ecological thinking. You know, that is how we interconnect and coexist with other species in a relational paradigm that goes beyond othering. And also because I'm here to talk about ecology and writing from a writer's perspective, I'll begin by describing the ways in which an eco-consciousness formed in my thinking and imagination as a means to begin this exploration of relationality between the imaginal and the ecological, inside and outside, this and that. So I'll ask for a slide change, please. Okay, so what do I mean by when I say eco-consciousness? What do I mean by eco-consciousness? So I'm just going to use a perspective from the poet and thinker, eco-thinker Forrest Gander, when he talks about environmental literacy. And he says that it's a capacity for reading connections between the environment and its inhabitants. Now, I understand that this is a simplistic definition, but I think it suffices for now and for my needs to explicate the manner in which the natural world began to inhabit my imagination and psyche, and therefore fed me as a writer. So, first of all, growing up in the 1980s, 1990s, in a small seaside town called Port Dickson in Peninsular Malaysia, that was an education in relationality. So not simply to the small and certainly at times claustrophobic community, but also in terms of the natural world. So this was a time before overdevelopment, reduced portions of the land to naked, barren spaces that have become populated by concrete blocks, particularly malls. In Malaysia, we love malls. So we have many malls around. Many trees have been chopped down for consumerism. So we have these spaces that are populated by concrete blocks, all in the name of what I like to call a neo-colonial neurosis for development. But some decades ago, surrounding our house in Port Dickson was a conglomeration of wildlife. The bats, snakes, monkeys, miners, kingfishers, crows, an assortment of trees, still intact, unlike in recent times when many of these very old trees are chopped down, because I recently discovered that it costs around $2,000 to chop down one tree, and the money goes into the pockets of businessmen and their politician friends. So a tree is very costly. But let me just show you a couple of pictures of Port Dickson, just to give you a pictorial glimpse of the place I'm talking about and what fuels my writing. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So these are photos I took just last week. I went on an excursion to take photos for this talk. And it's becoming common now in many parts of the country and also in Port Dickson for trees to be cut. And these trees have been there for many decades. So the picture of the two plastic cups sweating in the heat on a tree stump tells its own story. I don't think I need to explicate. And in fact, I think we should run a story writing competition with that photo as a prompt. Next slide, please. This is the land near my house that's being cleared for the building of a mall. So we hear, these are the rumors. And this land and many other parts of Port Dickson, they're home to many species of monkeys, wild boars, other wild animals, and they're now all displaced. But not long ago, we spotted 2 wild boars just roaming around in an abandoned tennis court. So that is a very surreal sight indeed. And the next slide, please. Yeah, but there are still spots of land like this one that remain. This one is opposite my family home, and this has actually become a source of writing and inspiration for me, which I'll touch on a bit later on when I talk about writing eco-poetry. Okay, picture time over. Continue. Next slide, please. Okay, so when I was growing up, the lushness of our surroundings was prominent. So in other words, there was a proliferation of life in the form of other species. So I'm talking here about exposure, exposure to the natural world, to other species as a preliminary and important feature of this dance of relationality between self and other, between psychical and ecological. Contact as a form of connection, or it can be. So I think two factors contribute to this relationality or to this dance. One is exposure or contact, and the second is how this contact is received. So seeing and observing the natural world is one thing, and communing with it is another. So I believe this, the dance between the world of my imagination and the world of animals and plants really began when communion began. So a kind of dialogue between the inner world and the outer world of wildlife. And that's steeped in wonder, it's steeped in curiosity, which then also acts as a mirror that reflects back something fundamental in ourselves. And that's a point I will touch on later when I speak about this reconceptualization of self when we include the environment in discussions about the self and what the self means. And in the Vedas, the world is described as time-space causation. And the word time-space causation is Maya. And Maya, of course, I'm sure most people in the audience know this. I'm speaking to an Indian audience. So Maya, although often referred to as illusion, carried the connotation of magic. And it's this aspect of magic that gets forgotten, I think, beyond childhood, and that gets lost in the language of separation that fuels, all kinds of domination, from colonialism, oppression of marginalized and disenfranchised communities, and also, of course, of nature. Interestingly, this concept of the magic of the natural world is present also in the pre-colonial Malay belief system, specifically in the context of animism. So contact, communion, dialogue with the natural world can hold space for the expansion and development of this magic, as it did in my foundational years. And I think the imagination is a vital vehicle for igniting or reigniting the recognition of the magic of the natural world, which also acts as a mirror for seeing into ourselves. Next slide, please. So having been in the company of wildlife in this way, eventually gave birth to a very peculiar fictional island, which Shivani referred to earlier, that was drawn out of this early engagement. So in 2010, having completed a novel that I can now say was terribly dense and unreadable and unpublishable, I gave myself a break, of thoughts. So I still wanted to write, but I wanted to write something that I considered to be fun. And I wanted to write something without the pressure of having to create the great Malaysian novel, which of course I believe I'd just done with the manuscript I'd completed. It wasn't the great Malaysian novel, and it hasn't seen the light of day. I mean, I'm the only person who has read it, and it shall remain that way. And it was in the process of starting to write without an agenda, without even a notion of what it is I wanted to do, that the first story of my first book, which Shivani mentioned, Wildlife on Coal Island, which is what you see on the screen here, which is a collection of short stories. This space, Coal Island, which is a fictional island, was created. And it didn't take long for me to realize that this space was an imaginal recreation of the Port Dickson of my youth. So the creatures, plants, trees of my youth that had filled my external world had quietly, secretly been populating my inner world, molding its structures, developing its dimensions, all the while without me consciously doing anything. So, in other words, the formation of the world of my imagination was occurring spontaneously, and I would say rather mysteriously, and in relation to the natural world. Of course, there are other components, that contribute to the formation of this imaginal world, such as ancestral memory, desires, cultural memories, personal memories, and so on. But ultimately, what unites all these is the fact that impressions are made in the region of the mind where the imagination dwells. And more time spent in nature means more natural impressions made on this inner world. So the bats that lived in our roof when I was growing up, for example, transformed into the bats that appeared in the final story of my book. And they featured not as creatures to be feared, but as animals that simply coexist with human beings. That's because when they were living inside our roof, I considered them to be merely an extension of our home, or rather a part of our home, a part of our existence. And when I was writing that story, there was no prior philosophizing, that occurred before the bats were included in the story. They simply entered the story, as characters that inhabited this world, our world. And the protagonist speaks to the bats as a means to speak to herself and understand something about herself. So the psyche and the animal are intertwined in moments of meaning making that acknowledge the coexistence of both. So this is what I mean by exposure and communion, and how that gets interiorized and then feeds into the evolution of the imagination in me, the writer. And in the story itself, the imagination actually acts as an in-between space that links the bats on the outside and the protagonist's inner lens of perception. I think it's a good moment in this talk to mention that the imagination is a crucial component in the expansion of eco-consciousness. And this is something that Sridini touched on wonderfully in her introduction as well. And I say this from personal experience and also from having read the writings of eco-poets, eco-critics, eco-activists, that a big part of the problem we're facing is that environmental issues often appear abstract until you feel the heat, right? In Malaysia, the temperature has certainly gone up by, I don't know by how much, but it feels extremely hot here. So you're actually experiencing it as something visceral. But until you do, the environmental issues can appear very abstract. You don't feel them, which is why Vandana Shiva said that, one way to make everyone see the importance of climate change is to bring it down from the stratosphere, right? And of course, what I've just described in terms of the relationship between the natural world and my imagination is more of the spontaneous formation of parts of my inner creative world. I haven't touched yet on how eco-consciousness can become or does become integrated into writing in a more conscious way, where we start to raise these issues in an overt way in the writing. So not just as a kind of natural response to how I had grown up or had been exposed to these things, but actually actively applying these themes and issues in the writing. So I'll touch on that shortly. But first, I think it's important to take note of the place of the imagination in the development of eco-consciousness. And can we change the slide, please? Is it the next? Is there another one? There's one with the, there we are. Yes, that's correct. Yes, this is the one. So I got a bit confused. Yes, this quotation by Joy Graham, which I think is a great one. She says, the poet Joy Graham, she says, people know this information already, so why do they need it in a poem? And that's precisely the point, is that they know it They know it intellectually, they know it is information, but they're not feeling it. And that's why activists in the environmental movement are asking of us, help it be felt, help it be imagined. So an imagination that's sharpened, that's alive to the environment and its issues is important. An imagination that's alive to the magic and sacredness surrounding us. And going back to the Vedas, the sacredness of the earth, it's emphasized through the diversity of life forms. The interconnectedness between human beings and the natural world is expressed in prayers, chants, rituals. And this advanced eco-consciousness has actually become diluted, through the process of European colonization that brought with it a language of separation, power, domination, which has become normalized in today's neo-colonial capitalist world. I'm going to the post-colonial scholar Edward Said, who talks about the exploitation of the natural world and imperialism as happening simultaneously, since the colonialists' descriptions of nature was part of the process of dominating it. In claiming knowledge of it, they were also claiming power over it and the people that inhabited it. The exploitation of nature, exploitation of colonized people, it's founded upon the same story of separation. It stays in this realm of duality. It doesn't transcend. It says human versus non-human. It's a language of othering, civilization versus wildness or wilderness. And it's premised on that hierarchy, right? A hierarchy with human beings at the peak of the so-called hierarchy. Let's have a slide change, please. Thanks. But the power here is that in writing, the separation can be questioned, it can be examined, be interrogated, and it can be dissolved. And that's something that I've begun to do more consciously in my writing, and which comes through in somewhat different ways in terms of genre, which is why I've decided to focus on the different ways in which these issues appear in poetry and then how they appear in prose. This is a literature gathering after all, so I thought it might be of interest. And this distinction between genres, it could be a personal proclivity or the tendencies of the genre. I think most likely it is both. So I thought I'll start with poetry because I call it my original tongue, but it's not just me, it's also the original tongue in a collective sense. Our earliest creative verbal expressions are poetry. And I'm not going to the details of nature-inspired poetry. I think we've all heard enough about romantic influences and poems that praise and elevate the natural world. These certainly characterize my early poetry as well. The romantics for my teenage bedtime reading, as it was for, I think, many kids interested in poetry, especially in post-colonial countries. But I do see early poetry that celebrates nature, that captures nature in some kind of, idealized and pristine form. I do see it as potentially a precursor to, or it can be a precursor to taking the environment seriously. It has been the case for me, and from what I've seen and read, it's the case for many eco-poets, out of the love and camaraderie felt for animals and plants, which comes from the contact and communion I mentioned at the start of my talk. Out of this love and camaraderie appear the non-romantic impulse to protect, nurture, and save the earth, and to recognize that ecological consciousness is both about witnessing the beautiful forest, celebrating that beautiful forest, and the tractor just a few kilometers away. And I love that idea and that image. It comes from Wendell Berry, the poet and eco-thinker and farmer. So, in terms of how it relates to my writing, there's a conscious sharpening, of how the environment is woven into my poetry and my poetics, and has generated a series of eco-poems, which I'm going to touch on shortly. So, things in the natural world enter my poetry mainly as points of affirmation. Name them, celebrate them, recognize their importance in the relational aspect of our lives. That is the ways in which they influence, impress upon, and are in a state of interbeing with us. That's a term that I go back to over and over again, which I think some of you already know that term. which has been used by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh when he talks about the interconnectedness of everything, and which can be a feature in eco-poetry, particularly of the kind of eco-poetry I write. Okay, so I thought that to get a better understanding of the genre, we can take a brief dive into the context of eco-poetry as a form of poetry. Even though, poets sometimes they take issue with the term and they don't necessarily agree on what it means, but there are definitions, and ruminations that we can go by. And I think that exploring briefly together eco-poetry will enable us to look at some concepts that form a part of the eco-poetic discourse and also of my own eco-poems. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so we'll just return to Forrest Gander, because I think he says some very useful things about eco-poetry specifically. And so he writes that eco-logic is not focused on binaries and isn't dialectical, but questions the whole of subjectivity and rethinks the self as a collective singularity. So basically, the logic used in eco-poetry, the eco-logic, is one that, what I mentioned earlier, that transcends or goes beyond this dualistic thinking, the one that separates, right? And it's this type of thinking the environmental activists and the eco-poets tell us that's caused us to exploit animals in the natural world, right? Because we see them as less than or other, as a resource object to be used, rather than as the living earth itself, that we need, that's a part of us. The other important point of eco-poetry is that it also questions hyper-rationality, or overly rational thinking. And that stems from 18th century Enlightenment thinking, that very framework of thinking that mobilized the Industrial Revolution and colonization, and that's founded upon that story of separation. Of course, eco-poetry instead, it emphasizes interconnections or the expanded or collective self, very notion of self, what it means to be a human being is turned around, it's problematized. Is there more to us than just these flesh suits? I use the term flesh suits I've borrowed it from one of my favorite Dharma teachers, Tara Brach. So she often refers to these flesh suits and asks us to think beyond the flesh suits. In one of the Native American poet Joy Harjo's poems, a beautiful poem, because in that poem she talks about the fluid interrelations between a self that shape shifts into the wind, into the elements, so that by the end, a self is so much bigger than simply a person with a body and a mind, but the self also includes the environment. So it's at this point I'll locate the particular orientation my eco-poems take, and that's when the very notion of self expands, it transforms, and begins to include the non-human. So my eco-poems also demonstrate the shifts that occur in the observer of the natural world. And in this way, I feel very much a student of writers like Mary Oliver and Annie Dillard, because both of them engage with the natural world in ways that destabilize a narrow sense of self. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? We're going to get into some poetry, so I'm going to share some poetry. Before I do that, just as to contextualize, so I said earlier that I've become more intentional in terms of how I integrate this eco-consciousness into my writing. So this brings me to my very intentional writing project during one of the pandemic lockdowns, when I decided that I wanted to commune with the natural world in a more targeted and conscious way and write poetry in response to that, as a means to also heal the rupture and disconnection that I and many others, were feeling during this time. So I sat in front of that secondary jungle that you saw earlier in one of the photographs opposite our house in Port Dickson, and basically, just opened myself up to the world around me and allowed the communion between inside and outside to occur. That dance I've been referring to, in which a bird, a butterfly, a grasshopper, a weed, would pull something out of my inner world and work, in tandem with it. So I wrote a poem a day. Yes, it was a very fertile period that the world was giving me a lot, it was lighting my imagination up. So I wrote a poem a day, and the process revealed to me not only the interconnections between inner and outer environment, but also changes that occur in the definition and experience of self. So I will pause here to read a poem from this lockdown series that illustrates what I've been saying. It's always good to have examples. Don't trust everything I say. see what I'm demonstrating, what I write. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. So this was written in a moment that began on, I suppose, what you would call an internally melancholic note, but that was transformed by the witnessing of a bird in the external world that led to a revelation about the interconnection between the speaker and the entire living, breathing earth. And this poem appears in my collection, Being Born. I thought I'll just read it from here rather than from the screen, just because it's always nice to read from a book, I find. Okay. This whole damn earth. Cloud mood lags today. Lampposts morose, abstract. Buildings empty, gates to our beach shut, gaps between railings and potted plants, between edge A and edge B, no other face around. Something too big is absent, like a limb, like lungs, like a heart. We ghosts look everywhere for it, our breeze bodies sunken, pining. A pair of small, black beaded eyes locks onto ours, a little black-breasted clue emerges. The entire foliage, this whole damn earth breathes with us. This whole damn earth rubs clay into us, gives birth to us out of breeze, right here, right now, in one miraculous swoop. Okay, so that's an example of one of those poems that came out of that pandemic period. So we can move on to the next slide, and we're also making a transition to prose now. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, my creative compost was formed in an environment that was fertile with wildlife and nature. So the natural world leaks into my prose in a very effortless way as well. But the only major difference is that in prose, this natural landscape is often accompanied by very place-specific concerns that are tied to national, diasporic, and postcolonial concerns. So in other words, issues around the environment are complicated by considerations of migration, acculturation, displacement, replacement, and decolonization in the endeavors to carve out national identity, which are all preoccupations for me as a Sri Lankan Tamil Malaysian living in multicultural, multi-ethnic Malaysia. And I'd say the most obvious reason why these topics emerge in prose alongside the environmental context is because in prose we enter into the realm of time and space, and therefore the canvas, it grows horizontal. More shades, more images, more events. We are in the space and kingdom of stories. So when I talk about my fiction and the way I write it, I use the term place-based. Place here covers a range of aspects like geography, environment, culture, social structures, politics, architecture, the whole gamut, everything. It's messy, it's plural, it's plurality. And I find this particularly important when we're writing from spaces and places that are marginalized, unseen, silenced, non-mainstream, because there aren't enough stories and images of ourselves out there. So location becomes important. This is something that I prioritize in my teaching of creative writing in Malaysia as well. It's trying to get my students to recognize themselves in their stories rather than mimicking what's coming from the West. That still happens a lot. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what exactly do I mean when I talk about place-based writing? So very simply, it's writing that can't not acknowledge context and setting, because to do so would be to violate history, to violate voice, particularly because there are histories and voices that have been misrepresented, underrepresented, unrepresented, and so on. And I venture to say that most post-colonial and diasporic literary texts are place-based, in that in order to understand the complex narratives and webs of relationships in the lives of migrants and people, unshackling from the bonds of colonialism, place, setting, and space, they become primary points of investigation. We think of Naipaul writing books like, A House for Mr. Biswas, where, ownership and habitation of a house was a matter of, urgency, even emergency. And in fact, his Miguel Street, which actually inspired wildlife on Coal Island, conveyed, how the fictional Trinidadian street was as much a character, as the people who lived on it. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So, and I've discovered that extensions and a deepening of these narratives of belonging and settling and becoming a part of a place. So I see how these types of narratives are expanding, and this has become pronounced in the latest novel that I'm writing, which is requiring me to do research on geology, on environmental issues, and the ecological health of the very setting of my story. So in this novel that has yet to be written, and I've been threatening to write for 10 years, so let's hope it gets written by next year. So I have a protagonist who attempts to find answers to who he is. Having left his native Malaysia, he also comes from Coal Island. All my characters now live and breathe and exist on Coal Island. So he's left his native Malaysia to live in the UK, and his process entails not just a questioning of national, cultural, and ethnic loyalties, but also the physical landscapes of each country. And I think in today's world, it becomes difficult to investigate things like place, space, belonging, non-belonging, without also considering environmental issues and to take note of ecological concerns that inevitably factor into who we are and where we're going. So just as ecological concerns consciously enter my poetry in the form of eco-poetry, in prose too, ecological themes appear in overt ways. So I found that the more I look at the local landscape of my novel setting, the more it became evident that when we talk about identity, belonging, location, displacement, we also have to talk about these topics as a species, and in a world that's threatened, by environmental destruction. So what place means today necessarily involves environment and the natural world. I go back to Amitav Ghosh. I love his essay, Uncanny and Improbable Events, This quote is from that essay. And I'm with him when he asks this question, of the place of the non-human in the modern novel, and the position of the collective, especially in today's Anthropocene age, which is named because of human involvement in geological processes, which, prior to the age of the human was the domain of natural forces. And he writes in this essay that it was exactly in the Anthropocene, in which human activity was changing the Earth's atmosphere, that the literary imagination became radically centered on the human. And the turn away from the communal and the collective in the modern novel, which tends to be the domain of the individual. It's not helped in the using of the modern novel to tell the story of environmental crisis, which is the story of the many rather than of the few. So he continues, at exactly the time when it has become clear that global warming is in every sense a collective predicament, humanity finds itself in the thrall of a dominant culture in which the idea of the collective has been exiled from politics, economics, and literature alike. In terms of how precisely this applies to the novel I'm writing, all I know is that there is a conscious working between the witnessing of the outer environment and inner imagination, and a desire to integrate the two to address key environmental concerns. And I'm still in the process of researching, so but research is taking me into new territories like geology and further into ecology, and it's pushing me to consider new, deeper meanings of place, which the communal, the national, the non-human, which include all of these, and attempting to find a new language to express these hybrid realities. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually end with a brief reading from my novel Yalpanam, but before I do that, I want to share this quote by the poet Joy Harjo, who I mentioned earlier, because I think this quote really captures this movement, this dance between outside and inside, imaginal and ecological, which I've been attempting to describe. And I'll quote from her. All landscapes have a history, much the same as people exist within cultures, even tribes. There are distinct voices, languages that belong to particular areas. There are voices inside rocks, shallow washes, shifting skies. They are not silent. And there is movement. Not always the violent motion of earthquakes associated with the Earth's motion, or the steady unseen swirl through the heavens, but other motion, subtle, unseen, like breathing. A motion, a sound, that if you allow your own inner workings to stop long enough, moves into the place inside you that mirrors a similar landscape. You too can see it, feel it, hear it, know it. So she's speaking here about the aliveness of the natural world that moves into a place inside us and mirrors back to us something about ourselves. Then we see ourselves out there and also in here simultaneously. And we enter the world of paradox, where there is both duality and a transcendence of it. So we'll go to the next slide. Yeah. So I'm going to end by reading an excerpt from my novel Yalpanam. This one here. And you see it on the screen, of course. The novel has two protagonists, one of whom is Pushpanayagi, this lady in the front cover. And she's 186 years old. You can ask me why later if you're interested to know why she's 186 years old. And basically, when we meet her, she realizes that her life isn't ending quite yet. She thinks she's about to die, but actually not. She's on a journey of metamorphosis, of transformation. And she's entering a realm of discovery and expression. And I selected a section that describes the interconnection between psyche and natural environment as a way to concretize what I've been saying about the connection between the two. I think I shall drink some water first. Between the cracks and tears, in the crevices of their desperation, a little weed, a few inches tall, upright, weaves its body defiant of stone and concrete, insistent on its right to live. The old woman would not pluck it. The numerous and various people before her would not pluck the weed that had been here before this weed was able to be. Some may gaze upon the weed that has thrust its way through what little space it has been given. Others may look beyond it, at the roses shimmering with dew, for example, or at the mangoes hanging low from thickly foliaged branches. A few, like the old woman, have eyes that cannot waver from the tiny clover-shaped leaves of this plant that would not be. Through a gap in the veranda steps, the weed pushes forth, mad for air, touched by moonlight. It had happened before, in the old days when the house was still fresh, and Charles Tanner is a colonialist, and this is set in the 19th century, this portion. And Charles Tanner cringed at the sight of monitor lizards that sometimes promenaded at the back of the house, close to the mouth of the jungle. In those older days, small tender plants grew through unseen fissures in wooden planks from time to time, as though they knew when to begin living despite their fate. Who would see them? There were plantations to oversee, land to be dug, trees to transplant, tea parties to be had, wildlife to capture, offices to run, coal to be shipped. But amidst all this, after she had been under the banyan tree that had once stood like a courtly umbrella opposite the house, Pushpanayagi returned to the garden, her heart heavy with stories told by the island's men, the roots of their fears and loneliness curling, pullulating through her belly, and she sat in the quietest corner of the compound near the well, where only the frogs dared to croak and the birds dared to warble. There, where the back of the house faced the jungle, where the beams of wood were rarely noticed, a single weed, sometimes an inkling of a plant, germinated through one of those apertures famous for welcoming neglected things. It may have been because the frogs and the visiting birds cried out to the most malleable corner of Pushpanagi's heart, or because she was born with eyes destined to look at small objects, a lens for specks and flecks and grit. But she gazed at whatever tiny life was growing out of the house with a look very close to grief. Perhaps it was what the men had said, confessions heard by her, by the pause of the island, by the universe, that made her look the way she did. Or maybe it was the mystery of why only men sought her ears. But the indisputable truth, acknowledged or unacknowledged by her, was that the weed that she watched also watched back. A faint line of light stretched between her eyes and the weed, and as she fell deeper into its form, its little tip bowed, and a smile appeared on her face. A smile not small, not wide, a smile that marked comfort. Then the frogs and the birds would grow still and silent, and she spoke. She told them what she had never told anyone and would over the years stop telling any sentient thing, even herself. But on those days, when a weed or hint of a plant chose to emerge through a dark cleft, he spoke of the hatred that burned in the hearts of certain local islanders towards the British, of the fear that coursed through the blood of British officers that brought darkness into their faces, of the worthlessness that had leaked into bones and made them cold, of the loneliness that gnawed at the base of every man like a disease. She spoke of what she was doing on the island, so far away from her original island on the Indian Ocean, of her suspicions that she had come all this way for nothing but to ingest every microscopic element the island brought to her, of her fears that one day she would go deaf. It has to be said that the weed Sorry? Oh, okay. Which part did you lose me at? Did you did you get to the end of the reading? Okay. The weed. Yes, that's the end. Do you need me to repeat anything? That can be done.
It has to be said that the weed.
Oh, okay, let us look at that. It has to be said. Oh, yeah, that's just towards the end. I mean, I can complete it if you like.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it the last?
Yes.
Shall I complete it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, it has to be said that the weed or potential of a plant, both essentially weeds since they are unwanted, unseen, whichever it was at the time of her declarations, listened, but gave no advice. It is not in the life stream of weeds, particularly weeds that choose to live through cracks, to goad and soothe and whisper decisions or plans of action to whoever is spending time with them. No, these weeds only welcome the time given to them and the gazes bestowed upon them. They offer their whole being with every wilt and every flutter, whether reciprocated or not. That's the end. Thank you for listening. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivani. I hope you can hear the applauses
Yes, I can.
for your talk and for your reading of the novel.
That warms my heart.
I think we have a couple of questions, a question or two.
Yeah. Let me Finally, thank you.
Dr. Shivani, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Mitali here. So that was a very illuminating talk. First, a very critical insight on what eco-poetry is from an author's perspective. But what really caught my ears were the way you have, the choice of diction in your novel. That's what caught my ears. So somewhere your lines of the novels, they run to I think 3-4 lines. A sentence of your novel runs to 3-4 lines, and every word that you have picked, I suppose, of course you can tell me better, but I suppose they're very specifically picked. The diction is very specifically chosen, and somewhere every sentence of your novel is echoing the different perspectives. There are many extrinsic perspectives that I could catch in your lines. So there is coloniality somewhere, there is environmental approach somewhere, there is just a story of a small weed separately culled out from your novel. So that was very interesting, how you are weaving it in just one not even a novel, but I'm just talking about a sentence that, or just an excerpt that you read from your novel. So just a question to you as the author means, did you really deliberately pick those words, or you had these extrinsic approaches when you were writing or crafting this particular excerpt?
I didn't catch your name, Dr.
Mitali, Dr. Mitali.
Natalie, thank you so much for your sensitivity. I think you picked up on many aspects just from that excerpt. You've identified that it always makes me happy when a reader or a listener is able to pick up on the specific words that I use, because those words are used extremely carefully. So every word has to carry its own meaning, but also contribute to the totality of the meaning that I'm trying to communicate. So in terms of these different perspectives coming through, right? So you mentioned, there's colonialism, there's just the focusing of the image of the weed. I'll just tell you a little bit of how, there isn't this conscious decision made before I start writing, okay, I'm going to make this about, colonialism, or I'm going to weave all these different things together. What tends to happen is that I run with an image. So an image and the emotion that needs to be captured in this particular section. So in this particular section, the emotive landscape was very clearly, I knew what I had to capture, which was the element of regret, the element of not being seen, and the element of grief that comes with that. So being very aware of that emotive landscape, because fiction is about human emotion. That's it. There may be many ideas that you will explore, but ultimately you can't explore them without connecting it to human emotion. Otherwise, we'll write an academic essay, for example, or we'll write a news article or something non-fiction maybe. Creative non-fiction is a different thing, but non-fiction straightforward. You don't need to bring in too much emotion. So ultimately, I start at that. What is the emotion that needs to be conveyed in this section? And what are the images that are associated with that? And of course, what's the story around that? Because this is prose ultimately. So going with that, and of course, you've just seen an excerpt. So the larger context is that there are issues of colonialism that are being investigated. There are issues of marginalized characters. So this fits into that larger narrative. And so what happens is I just follow the image and stay true to the emotional landscape of that section. And because this is where I think my experience as a poet comes in. So I've been accused of being too lyrical in this. Some people like it, some people find that maybe it's too poetic at times. So that the the section that I just read is a very lyrical section. In many ways, I wrote that in a similar way that I would write poetry, as in kind of this flowing with the image and the emotion and reaching a particular point.
Yeah, we can hear that.
And then these other themes inevitably come in, like colonialism and just focusing on the weed as a means to reflect the psychical condition of Pushpanayagi. Those things were just components of the story that had already been set. And so, yeah, so that this section just came out of the need to communicate that particular emotional reality for the character. I don't know if does that answer the question?
Yes.
Do you want to
thank
clarify anything else?
No, thank you, Dr. Shivani. In fact, as a researcher, you're able to, like pick so many different kind of ideas to really explore in your works. Yeah, thank you for that excerpt.
Thank you. I mean, to be honest with you, sometimes I find that there's so much, there are many layers in my imagination. So sometimes I myself, when I look back at older things, I find that there are many things I didn't even notice when I was writing. So yes, a very dense, multi-layered imagination, I would say. Fed by the natural world, very much nourished by the natural world, you see. So very thankful for that.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Shivani. Any other question?
Don't be shy.
Hello, Dr. Shivani. I'm Sai Harshita, research scholar from the department. I was intrigued by the title of your first book, Wildlife on Coal Island. The coal island, though an imaginative space, inspired from the external natural world in which you grew up. Why Coal Island? It feels too anthropocentric for it to be called Coal Island, whereas you talked about how there's a jungle and the bats and the monkeys and the occasional pythons. Coal Island seems to be too industrialized. If I am as somebody who's not yet read the work, if I am to imagine the work based on the title, I imagine coal industries and truckloads of black rocks being shipped and so on. But may I know the intention behind naming your works with that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very insightful question. It's the first time anybody's asked me this, actually. I mean, they have asked why Coal Island, but they haven't quite linked it to this anthropocentric notion, that this sounds like a very industrialized, space. Actually, the another name for Port Dickson, which is it is based on Port Dickson, where I grew up, the place that I was talking about earlier. In colonial times, was called Pulau Arang. Pulau Arang is basically Coal Island. That's the translation from Malay. So I just did a very, very straightforward conversion from it. So it's steeped in history, essentially. And it felt to fit this, because I'm not completely inventing a new place. It's not like doing a Tolkien. It's not a fantastical space. It is. It's very similar to Malgudi. In fact, I was inspired by Arkinarayan because I grew up reading Arkinarayan. So you can actually, when you enter Coal Island, it's a very recognizable space. In fact, many people have talked about it in terms of, this is very, Malaysian. It's like small town Malaysia. Could be any small town in this country. So it's just, I can't say more. It's not a very imaginative, I don't have any sort of more imaginative answer than it was just a simple case of using some element from history and infusing that into my fictional space. And of course, there was also the coal industry on this island of mine. So as a kind of, going back to contextualizing it as a space. Although I haven't actually had, in none of the stories does coal feature, actually. Maybe that could be a future story.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks for the question.
Do we have any more questions?
Hello, Dr. Shivani. This is Soumya.
Oh, hi Soumya, nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. So basically you have spoken about how natural environment has been your muse for your fictional work. So have you also ventured into any other topic for your fiction or any of your other creative work? Anything else has been your muse other than the natural environment?
Oh, definitely. I mean, history is a big source of inspiration for me, and cultural heritage, because my grandparents came from Jaffna, hence the title of this novel also. It's Yalpanam is the Tamil word for Jaffna in Sri Lanka. So they arrived in Malaya in the early 20th century. And I find that a lot of my work, whether it is in fiction, non-fiction, poetry, is about piecing this history. It's a personal history, but it's also a collective history, attempting to understand the links between there and here, what has been lost, because there has been so many pieces of cultural memory that are there, but they haven't been recovered yet. For example, I'm just starting to learn Tamil. It was which is the language of my grandparents. Of my people. So there's been a lot of disconnection between my own culture and history. And I think it's very common for migrant communities, particularly, as they're adjusting to life in the new land, is how do we adapt? How do we acculturate? You want to survive, and many things get lost along the way. Many compromises that are made. So, and that is, I think it is very normal and natural for communities to do that. But at the same time, there's a lot of grief in that, because, as I said, many things get lost, many things have to be suppressed. And I find that now I feel like this is my gig, this is my work, at least I think for the next, I don't know, however many decades, is to keep recovering that history, the voices that have been suppressed in my culture and my community, but also just generally in Malaysia, in the Malaysian context. But right now it's focusing on what's been lost in my family history, in my cultural history. So that is a big source of investigation and inspiration for me.
Thank you.
Another one question. Actually, I'll go back to the question that you were expecting us to ask. 106 years old grandmother there. But then even before you answer this question, why you have picked that 106 as the age, I would like to guess why it could be. Means as a listener, of course, I've not read your work, but as a listener to you and the excerpts. So I just feel maybe that 106, that number, because 100 and up is older than the old. And I don't know, maybe I'm just equating this 106 with the banyan tree that was there in the compound of the grandma. So I don't know, this is what I'm trying to guess why this 106. And now can you please illuminate us with your reason?
I love that answer, and I think I'm going to use it as an answer for my future. Actually, initially she was so she always appeared, when she appeared so this is how she appeared. She appeared 10, 12, maybe 12 years ago in my imagination. There was this picture of a very large old woman in a white sari. That's why she's white. This is, by the way, a painting of a photograph of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother.
Oh, okay.
And in my imagination, Pushpanagi is not my grandmother, but she resembles my grandmother. And in any case, the image of a very large, very old woman in a white sari squatting in a garden, that was the first image that appeared. And I was very intrigued by her, that I started following that image, and that image led me to the house that she lived in, which is Yalpanam. And then, I realized that she was a very, very, very old woman. How old? beyond, over 100, but initially, something such as 200 years old. So initially she was, I was guessing as 200 years old, but eventually the character herself basically said, I'm 186 years old. Why so precise? What is 186? What is the significance of that number? No significance at all. It's just that I'm 186 years old. That is the number. But later on, as I was writing the story, I realized that actually the age, and of course, my writing is, some people call it magical realist or whatever. And okay, there are those elements. But the age is really to do with the amount. It's like her psychological age or the psychical age. The how much of the burden of the past that she's carrying. She's carrying so much from the past. Because she left Ceylon in the 19th century. She's carrying all these memories and all these psychological burdens that haven't been processed yet. And this whole novel is essentially about releasing the burdens of the past, both her own and also of a cultural memory and so on. And so that age then becomes significant because it's not just her physical age, but it's also the age of her inner world, that has to be, so in that sense, it's realistic because we carry a lot of old things in us. We can carry the memories and the trauma of our grandparents. We're carrying that in us, and that means that there's so much ancientness in us. So that's like the allegorical or metaphorical aspect of the age. And then in terms of 186, that was basically determining that's the age, because 200 is too neat.
Oh, beautiful, lovely, very convincing explanation. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shivani.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivani, for your illuminating presentation and also for very patiently answering all the questions. Your talk, like every other conversation we have had, has been extremely thoughtful and will leave all of us with insights on how to explore fertile landscape where creativity and environmental consciousness converge. We feel truly encouraged to embrace the spirit of exploration, reflection, and inspiration. And thank you so much for elucidating upon storytelling's potential to inspire environmental action, deepen our reverence for nature, and prompt us to take responsibility for our planet's future. I hope all our listeners, whether as a writer, a reader, an environmentalist, or simply as an individual who cherishes the profound connection between words and the world around, have their imagination ignited and have a renewed sense of commitment to nurturing the environment through the power of storytelling. We now would like to present you with a token of our love and appreciation. Please accept it, Dr. Shivani.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's very, very thoughtful. Thank you so much to all of you. What a lovely audience. And thank you for the questions. And Sridini, thank you for moderating and introducing me earlier. Very grateful.
Thank you so much.
How do I? Oh, okay. So this is. Do I need to click on anything? No, right? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Sridini, I'll leave the call now?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
With that, we come to the end of the plenary sessions for this year's Retreat Edition 4. We will meet at 2 for the valedictory function. Thank you, Jai Sai Ram. The online viewers can watch it on YouTube at 6 o'clock. Thank you, Sai Ram.